Hi, and welcome to this webinar on leveraging your strengths. I am Simon from Capfinity. As you can see on the screen, we'd really strongly recommend before you dive into this session that you take some time either to just reflect upon your strengths, maybe read one of the books that we've got on the screen, this would be our best recommendation to actually take a strengths diagnostic. The one that we're going to be referring to throughout this session is the Capfinity free profile tool that you see a link for on the screen, but there's other choices there for you as well. The good thing is, whichever one you choose, the main thrust of what we're going to be talking about is essentially the same. So you're not going to be at a loss, however you reflect on your strengths before we start. So talking of starting, let's dig right in. So the first thing to bear in mind is that we perhaps don't know ourselves as much as we think we do. This is a delightful piece of research by Dr. Tasha Eurich, where she asked people whether they were truly self-aware, and 95% of the respondents said, yep, I am. Turns out, though, when she tested them, only 15% actually were, which was a shocking display of a lack of self-awareness on those people that thought they were self-aware. My own take on that, by the way, is that I love the fact that the 5% of people that actually said they weren't self-aware were actually self-aware enough to know they weren't self-aware, which that kind of blows my mind. But nonetheless, what we can take from that is that we perhaps don't have as clear a view of who we are as we maybe should do, and we perhaps don't realize how we're seen by others either. So actually focusing on our strengths is a really great way of starting to increase that self-awareness, and of course how we can positively add value. So before we really kind of get into what we define as strength being, what would be good is to take a little moment and just think about these two questions. So the first one, what de-energizes you at work? So when you think about it, you just think, ugh. And what energizes you at work? So when you think about doing it, you know you've got a day full of it. You're absolutely kind of buzzing for the day. You're really looking forward to it. So, and it might be something small on either end. So for instance, for me, kind of what de-energizes me would be filing, to be honest. I really can't stand it. I've got a filing tray just there, and it often fills up for quite some time before I get around to it. There's nothing about it that is enjoyable. And for me, on the other hand, what energizes me at work is actually running sessions, ideally live sessions. So at the moment, I'm trying to imagine that everyone is kind of behind my web camera and that actually people are there. But there's something about never quite knowing what's coming up. You don't quite know the question you're going to be asked. You're never too sure exactly who's going to be in the room. And it's just great to be able to hopefully share some things that really consolidate what people currently know. And from my point of view, maybe one or two new ways of thinking about things or of doing things that are going to come in handy. And that's, for me, that kind of really does it. So hopefully you've had your own example there as I've been talking. And basically what we've just been doing there is strength spotting. And you might notice the difference in how you felt when you were thinking about the thing that de-energizes you compared to the thing that energizes you. And even just listening to me talking about those two different things as well, how different actually we tend to talk about them. So one, it's kind of, we almost can't get away from it. Our intonation is less, we talk about it less, whereas actually for the thing that energizes us, we're quite literally energized even when we're just speaking about it. And that energy is one of the key things that we consider to be one of the three elements of what actually makes a strength. So the Capfinity definition is something you do well, something you do a lot, and something that energizes you. And we're going to look into the profile in a little bit, or the four quadrants in a little bit more detail, but they are the three key areas that we're really interested in. So do we do it well? How often do we do it? And crucially, does it energize us? Just because we do it well doesn't necessarily mean it's a strength in our eyes. If it doesn't energize us, then we wouldn't class it as a strength. And the reason why we want to actually have all three of those, there's a huge amount of research into what strengths do for us. And when we do get people to talking about their strengths and indeed talking about things that don't energize them, you can see these big differences. So and for far too long, companies, and you may well have experienced this yourself in a performance review in perhaps hopefully some other company that you've worked at in the past, where every 6 months your manager sits you down and they spend 3 minutes talking about what you're good at, and they say, right, for the next 6 months we're going to focus on these areas and that are your development areas, and actually what they're really focusing on is our weaknesses, and they're going to de-energize us. And as you can see, there's a whole heap of things there that we probably don't want to have when it comes to our day-to-day life. And if we're talking about those things that de-energize us, is those shorter responses, and we just don't feel authentic, and we're not going to perform particularly well. Whereas when we are focusing on our strengths, when we're talking about our strengths, we're passionate, we're focused, we're quick to learn, and the performance and all pretty much every study that's been done shows that every positive metric that we might want pretty much follows when we're focusing on our strengths and when we're working to our strengths. Doesn't mean entirely to our strengths, because there's always going to be some elements that aren't completely focused within our area of strengths, and that's absolutely fine. We're not talking about you have to ditch the current job just to find the one that's perfectly aligned to all your strengths. What it does mean, though, is that if we can focus on them a bit more on a day-to-day basis, we will tend to perform better, we'll feel more authentic, we'll be less stressed, and all of the stuff that comes from those three, to be honest. So I mentioned the 4 quadrants. So this is where we can really start to dive into where we can leverage those strengths in the best way. And these were created from our founder and CEO, Dr. Alex Lindley, who did a real significant amount of research before settling on these 4 key areas. And what she found was that if we look at our realized strengths, these are the ones that, as you can see, we're performing well at. We find them energizing and we are using them more frequently. So they are our realized strengths. Now, I said earlier that just because you're good at something doesn't necessarily mean it's a strength. And if we look directly underneath realized strengths in the bottom left quadrant, take a bow, learn behaviors. So these are the things that we're good at, or at least we think we're good at. We might be using them a lot. We might be not using them very much. So it's variable use. But crucially, they're not energizing us, and they may even be de-energizing us. So they're a learned behavior. And as you can see, we would suggest we only use those when needed, when we absolutely have to, when we can't utilize one of our strengths. Bottom right, we have our weaknesses. So these are the things that we're not good at, or at least we feel we're not good at, and are de-energizing, and often we're not using them a lot, which would make sense, because quite frankly, we should try and use them as little as possible. We're not going to, as we saw in that list a moment ago, there's not a lot of good comes from focusing on our weaknesses. And in fact, in focusing on our weaknesses, it may well detract us from working on our strengths. So really being aware of that can be useful. That isn't to say, of course, if we have a business critical area that is in our weaknesses, then of course we want to work on that so we get adequate at it. But trying to get brilliant at something that's currently a weakness might be, or at least we would suggest, we would be better putting our focus onto our strengths. Which brings us to the final quadrant, the top right, the unrealized strengths, which we at Capfinity consider to be our hidden pot of gold. These are the things that we are good at, that energize us, but for some reason, we're just not using them very much. So what we're going to be looking at for the rest of this session is how we can leverage those strengths, and particularly those unrealized strengths, and perhaps use our learned behaviors less, and definitely use our weaknesses less, so that we can really get the maximum benefit. So for me, just to give you an example, I talked about that hidden pot of gold. One of my unrealized strengths is creativity. And when the first lockdown happened, I basically didn't have any work. All of my work got cancelled pretty much on the same day. So I had nothing in my diary, but I had to work out how to make a living. And because up until then, I was doing 100% face-to-face events and face-to-face training workshops and things like that. So for me, I realized that I needed to rely on something that wasn't in my current wheelhouse of realized strength. So I leaned on creativity and thankfully started to work out ways in which I could still do my job. I could still do what I found energizing and that I was passionate about, but just in a different way. And therefore, having that unrealized strength and just bringing that into focus really helped me leverage that. And thankfully meant that I could still eat and still earn money, which is always a positive. So moving on to the next slide. So I've lost my mouse. If you saw me, if you saw my eyes suddenly get slightly panicky. What we can do is think about some questions that can really help us understand our strengths a bit better. So first and foremost, how are you using your realized strengths right now? And my suggestion would be, by the way, have a pause of this slide. So pause it and really have a good think. Let yourself kind of wander into it and think about, how are you using them right now? How do they show up for you on a day-to-day basis? Which learned behaviors are you perhaps using a bit too much? And if you have done one of the profile diagnostics, you'll have a list of those that perhaps you might just want to be wary of. And of course, weaknesses. How could you compensate for them? Because some of them will be potentially business critical. So are there any realized strengths or unrealized strengths that you could actually utilize to compensate for those or to mitigate for the fact that you're not great in that other particular area? And then, of course, finally, look at those unrealized strengths. Which could you use more? And if you haven't done a profile, but you've just been kind of reflecting on it, just think about the things that you're good at, that energize you, but you just don't use very frequently or very often. And have a think, have a further reflect, and that will hopefully really, really help give you a strong foundation for everything else we're about to look at. Just in case anyone, particularly for those of you that have done a profile, are starting to worry a little bit about your results, I thought it'd be worthwhile just sharing with you what the world picture looks like when it comes to strengths. Now, of course, everyone is unique. However, we have done thousands and thousands and thousands of profiles with people all over the world, and we've got a pretty good picture as to the most common strengths, weaknesses, learned behaviors, and unrealized strengths. So again, I'm not going to go through this in huge amount of detail. So please do, if you're interested, pause, zoom into it and have a good look. But there's a couple that is probably worth just bringing out. And the first is, if you worried if work ethic came up as a learned behavior, please don't. It is the number one most common learned behavior. So don't panic. There is no right or wrong strengths profile. There is just the authentic you. So it's absolutely fine. So for me, detail is definitely work ethic, by the way, is my number one learned behavior, and detail is right up there as well. So I'm bizarrely quite on the money when it comes to the learned behaviors. Interestingly, though, weaknesses. So the most common weaknesses, as you can see, is courage, competitive, adherence. Competitive and courage are actually in my realized strengths. So that's kind of nice that I'm opposite the norm. Adherence, though, is definitely one of my weaknesses. So that made and in case you're just sort of thinking what is adherence? What's that about? Essentially, it's following rules, adhering to rules, guidelines, that sort of thing. That's never really been my bag. So yeah, please don't. If you have done a profile, please don't worry about it ever, because it is literally a snapshot of you right now, and it can change. Unlike personality profiles, which can pretty much be quite fixed, according to the research, once we hit our teenage years, they might move a bit, but not massively. Our strengths profile very much can change. For instance, we might overuse one of our strengths, and therefore it might stop energizing us. Therefore, it would drop to a learned behavior. And indeed, a learned behavior might actually start to energize us. We might be in a different context, we might be in a different setting, and therefore things can change. But whatever your profile is right. It's the right profile for you. And what we're going to look at for the rest of the session is how can we leverage that? Whatever our profile is, what can we do? So again, another question for you. I know it sounds a bit weird. We have a reason, I promise. How do you pack for a holiday? So we've got a few different, we've got a few different options for you. So are you a last minute merchant? Are you the sort of person where your Uber arrives and you're still half packed? So you run out to the car with your suitcase in one hand and you're sort of just found your passport in the other, but you haven't actually packed them yet. Although not that you pack your suitcase, but you get my drift. Or do you make like lists a month in advance, so you know exactly what you're going to take and you tick them off as you go? Or are you somewhere in between? Do you make a bit of a plan, but you're quite open to that? Again, whichever way you're doing it is absolutely fine. We all have our preference, and there is no right nor wrong. But what we can find is that our strengths kind of shine through in our day-to-day ways of living. So for instance, if you're a planner, if planner is one of your strengths, then of course you would fall into the more organized kind of way of doing things. And if you're not, again, that's absolutely fine. It's not right or wrong. But to successfully leverage our strengths, what we want to understand and demonstrate is what is authentic for us, and learn to flex those strengths in different situations. So what we're going to think about is, what does that look like in practice? So this is a slide that popped up a moment ago just to tease you with it. So the first thing we would suggest is, rather than try and change what we're doing, is to actually flex our strength to the task at hand. The biggest kind of misconception is that success comes from doing our role purely based around our strengths. And that just isn't true. As I mentioned a little while ago, it's really about thinking, how can we change our approach to suit the task? How can we bring in the right strengths? So to give you an example there, we've got public speaking, something that most of us don't really enjoy. I'm a bit weird like that. I actually kind of enjoy doing it. Didn't used to, but I've learned to love it. It's become something that energizes me. Definitely didn't used to. And as you can see, there's 4 different strengths that potentially all could really, really help us with public speaking. Some of them we may have as our realized or unrealized strengths, others perhaps not. But there's lots of different ways to do the same task. So it could be we just bring our curiosity to the table. And even though we might perhaps not love having that spotlight on us and being the center of attention, if we really involve ourselves with being fascinated and curious, and therefore wanting to share that with people, that would make us a great public speaker. If we're great at explaining, well, that kind of speaks for itself. Rapport building, of course, again, that's a great strength to have when it comes to public speaking, to really get on with people. Any of these could be really, really helpful. And it doesn't matter if we're missing some. It really doesn't. There's all sorts of different ways in which we can get to essentially the same result. And we're not just talking about public speaking, of course. When it comes to any task, there is so many different strengths we can bring to bear that can really help. Just sticking on that subject for a moment though, TED Talks are a great example. So if ever you've watched a TED Talk, particularly the main TED conference that they have, I'm sure you'll agree the speakers are absolutely amazing, spellbinding, and just capture us for that 20 minutes or however long it is they have. But if you've watched a few, you'll know that everyone has a very different style, and it's their unique style. But they're not just told to like go on and just, they're given a subject and it's like, right, okay, you've got 18 minutes, crack on. TED works with them really closely to not only develop and hone their message, but also to make sure that their authentic selves come out. And if you, let's say you watched 15 TED Talks, there would be 15 different personalities. There'd be 15 different ways of bringing that information to bear. And that is the same with literally any task. There is so many different ways in which we can do it. It's not about always finding the job that suits our strengths. It's actually thinking, which strengths can I bring to bear for this particular task? And another way that we can really leverage our strengths is to bring authenticity and to reframe what we're doing. And as you can see, reframe, not revolutionizing. So thinking about, again, what is authentically us? And for instance, what is energizing us about this thing? And then reframing the task around that. So for instance, I talked about filing. So I could perhaps frame that as mission, if that is one of my strengths. So I really want to, I see it as something that is helping me get to where I need to go. And actually by keeping that kind of, by the way, I'm really trying to convince myself of this. If I could have that sort of clear filing tray, I'll always have what I need to be able to complete that mission. Or I could make it a competitive type exercise. So, right, I'm going to see if I can do it in under 5 minutes. There's, again, so many different ways we can reframe a task to actually suit one of our strengths. But again, really think about authenticness. There is no right nor wrong. So just think, what are my strengths? What could I bring to this particular task? And another thing we can do to kind of help leverage our strengths is remember we're not living in a vacuum and we're not working in a vacuum. So not only can we flex our strengths to the situation, but also to the person. So if we're dealing with a certain type of person that maybe we might find a little bit challenging, then I would always think, why do we find them challenging? What is it about that? And it may well be that they've just got a very different personality type from us, or they're bringing very different strengths to the party. So again, just think, what strengths can we bring that will perhaps help us get on with that person? And of course, if it's a person that we get on with really, really well, again, perhaps question that. Why is that? What similarities do we have? And again, what can we bring to the next time we meet up or we work with that person? And also just be careful not to overplay our strengths, because they can very much kind of, we can over rely on them. So for instance, when I'm working and doing training, one of in fact, my top strength is narrator. So kind of telling stories and the like. And it kind of makes sense that I would be doing that from a training point of view. However, one of my other strengths, as I mentioned, is competitiveness. And it wouldn't be so good if I was like really competitive with participants on training courses. That would just be a bit intense for everybody, myself included. So again, it's making sure that I'm picking the right strengths for the right situation. And of course, if I'm just out with my friends, then narrator perhaps wouldn't be the best strength to be bringing to a pub. Maybe it would. Everyone likes a good story, I suppose. But again, it's just thinking, for which people, which situations would be the best. And of course, the other thing is making sure that we're actually communicating our strengths. And it's one of those things that it can actually be quite difficult to do in an authentic way and effectively, because we don't want to feel like we're just kind of bragging. So a few different ways is firstly just to volunteer for things. Also think about what you want to be known for. And you can then sort of perhaps with that kind of personal brand, you can just let that speak for itself. So volunteer for the things that speak to what you want to be known for. Communicate through action. Just do the thing that you want to be known for as well. And people will start to take notice. And of course, you can talk about them. If you've had a great day, let your manager know, what was it about that made it a great day? And keep those communication lines open. And that can be really, really useful. So 4 main things then that we've talked about to leverage our strengths. So change your approach, not the task. Reframe, don't revolutionize. Flex your strengths to different people and situations. And do not forget to communicate what you want to be known for. The more you do, the more likely it is that you'll be given the sorts of work and the sorts of tasks that actually really energize you. And then kind of everyone wins at that point. But it is about finding the right balance. And again, this is a quote from our CEO, Alex Linley. So using strengths most optimally and effectively means using the right strength, the right amount, in the right way, and at the right time. Which seems simple when you say it, but the slight problem is pressure can disrupt that balance. And when we're stressed, we can overplay our strengths. And it can negatively impact our well-being. It can negatively impact our performance. And we need to look at those factors that can influence that and hopefully bring our conscious awareness on them so that we're less likely to get into those situations where our strengths might go to extremes and therefore not be as positive. So just like our strengths, extreme is different for everyone. And it can be really affected by all sorts of different things. The internal things, as we can see there, so strengths, preferences, values, beliefs, that can kind of trigger certain responses. So for me, one of my strongest values is fairness. And if I feel like something is unfair, whether it's to me or to somebody else, my strengths can work at extremes. So action is one of my realized strengths. So I can really jump in quite quickly. I've mentioned competitiveness. So I want to win that particular kind of fight or argument. When I say fight, not physical fight. And courage is, as I mentioned, is actually one of my strengths, which means, unfortunately, in the wrong kind of circumstance, sometimes courage can sponsor the other two. So I might overly stick up for my own values or for someone else's, and perhaps it wouldn't necessarily be the best sort of left unchecked. But it isn't just our internal things that can make a difference, it's also external. So the situation itself, it might be a time pressure type thing, which again, potentially might make us stressed and we would react to that. It could be the relationship, as we were talking about earlier on, so who the person is, if we've got previous with that person. And the environment itself, so is it a safe environment? Is it a brand new environment? Generally speaking, if something is new, then it's likely to cause us some stress. And we talk about stress now as like the stress response, but you may well have heard of it by a different name, which is the fight or flight response. So deep down, that stress response is actually being caused by our amygdala in the like lizard part of our brain, the really oldest part of our brain, that's the threat perceptor. And if it thinks back in the day, it would see an existential threat. So a wolf coming around the corner or something like that. And it would immediately send a message to our hypothalamus. And then in concert, they would send out all sorts of hormones and adrenaline, all that sort of stuff to prepare us to fight or run, physically prepare us to fight or run. So our heart rate would increase, our blood pressure would go up. We might shake a bit because our blood would be pooling in the main muscles that would enable us to fight or run. All sorts of different things happen in the blink of an eye to help us fight or flee. The thing is, these days, most of the time, the things that our amygdala is sensing as threats are actually not existential threats. It's just, oh no, I've got to make that phone call that I'm really not looking forward to. But the same process is kind of kicking in, maybe not to the same degree, but we actually have physiological changes when these things are left unchecked. Again, the great thing is, if we bring our conscious focus back to bear, we can start to reframe things and see that actually they're not as big a threat as perhaps the lizard part of our brain is sensing, and therefore we can do something about it. So it's really about being more emotionally agile, managing that mindset, and kind of keeping an open perspective on things, not immediately judging things to be horrendous, or I suppose really just increasing that self-awareness. So coming back to that research by Tasha Eurich, what can we do to hopefully be in that 15% of people that genuinely are truly self-aware? There's some other things that we also perhaps want to just be mindful of as well, which is what we would call the intention gap. So this is where we know what we want to be talking about, or we think we know how we're coming across, but the perception might be a little bit different. So our intention in this instance, if planner is our strength, our intention is to be organized and seen of as organized and proactive and managing risk really, really well. It can be perceived, particularly when we're stressed, and perhaps that strength is at an extreme. It could be perhaps be misperceived as you can see there, bossy, demanding, risk averse, or just generally not taking any action. So talking of action, as I mentioned a moment ago, action is one of my realized strengths. And for me, overdone, my intention is, they'll see me as someone who just likes to get in there, get things done, and jobs are good. And of course, if it's perhaps being overplayed, the perception might be that I'm impulsive or I'm reckless. I'm not thinking things through before I act. And that, of course, isn't what my intention at all. But particularly if I'm a bit stressed, it might come out that way. So again, it's just thinking about those potential blind spots. What strengths might we be perhaps overusing, particularly when stressed? And how might we mitigate those misperceptions that can occur? And the other thing I think is really, really key is to be kinder to ourselves. If you imagine someone in your team made a mistake, or they were just being really hard on themselves, how much compassion would you give to them? My guess would be probably a fair bit. You'd be really nice. You tell them it's just a mistake. We learn from our mistakes. Don't worry about it. Just learn from it, move on. Or if they were struggling, you would offer help. You wouldn't compound their struggles. So the question is, when you make a mistake, when you're struggling, do you offer yourself the same compassion? And most of us, the answer would be no, I do not. So practice self-compassion. It's a really, really important thing. We should be kinder to ourselves. And as you can see, there are a few quotes there that we can utilize to hopefully help with that and make sure. And yet, by the way, is a really lovely addition. Oh, I've forgotten. That's really annoying. I want to pause now and do it, but I can't. It's from Growth Mindset I've thought of it, Carol Dweck, Growth Mindset. She talks about the power of yet. Well worth a Google, by the way. And yeah, just adding in that word, you can see, I can't do this yet. It just completely changes our viewpoint on that. So be kinder to ourselves. If in doubt, just think, if my best friend was saying the things that I'm thinking to myself in terms of like, oh no, and being a real sort of doomsayer, what would I say to them? And then say that to yourself. And that can be really, really useful. As you can see, what advice would I give a friend? So a quick reminder of this section then when using our strengths to extremes. So do know what your extreme looks like. So try and practice that self-awareness, balance those strengths for optimal use. So if you realize you're overdoing a strength, overusing a strength, try and bring some others into the party, particularly if you know certain things trigger a bit of a strength response, shall we say. Do be aware of that annoying gap between your intention and the perception. Remember, it's not always the same, and therefore you might need to just think about how to mitigate that sometimes. And as we just talked about, practice self-compassion. So the final piece of the puzzle is to think about complementary partnerships, because we don't exist in a vacuum. There's other people around us, and that's a really lovely thing because we all have our own unique combination of strengths. And that means I can find people who have got realized strengths or unrealized strengths in areas that are actually my weaknesses or my learned behaviors. So when I'm working in a team, I can make sure that hopefully I can encourage the right kind of people around me. Or of course I can actually choose. So for instance, my accountant, I love my accountant. Not only is he a very nice person, but also he has a lot of strengths, which are my full-on weaknesses, or at the very best learned behaviors. So it's finding those people that actually are really good complementary partnerships. And you may find if you're in a relationship, a romantic relationship, you may actually find that you've actually got quite a lot of complementary strengths already. It could be worthwhile getting them perhaps to do a profile. And you may well find that. Certainly myself and my wife, we've got very different strengths, but actually it kind of works. It works really well because we can really help each other out when we need to. So the final thing then is to have one final reflect. And I say one final reflect, we'd very much suggest you carry on reflecting past here. But there's some questions here which again can help. So, have a pause, have a think about those. I really like that top one. What strengths got me here is I find it really interesting to look back at some of the key moments in my life, the decisions I made, some of the jobs I've done, and actually think back to like what caused that, what strengths were perhaps at play. And one in particular, so I used to want to be, when I was about 13, 14, I wanted to join the RAF, the Royal Air Force, and become a fighter pilot because, I'd watched Top Gun. And I thought, right, I'll join. The best way to kind of start off with that, I looked into it, and a couple of my friends who were already in the Air Training Corps, the ATC, which is the, if you haven't heard of it before, is like the youth arm of the Royal Air Force. And there's also an army, basically there's one for each of the main branches of the military. There's a youth version of that. So I joined the Air Training Corps and loved it. You had to do actually exams in like principles of flight and physics and stuff like that, and all sorts of stuff about like RAF history and things like that. And I've always been relatively good at exams. I aced those. You got to do loads of sports, and you got to fire weapons. I got my marksman's badge, which I was very proud of. You got to fly planes and gliders and things like that. And I always got glowing reports from the instructors that were with me. I represented the East of England for the Air Training Corps at athletics. I represented Bedfordshire and Cambridgeshire at football. So as far as I was concerned, I was the poster child for the Air Training Corps. Thing is, I left after 2.5 years. And the reason being, my friends that joined at the same time as me, had all got promoted at least once. I was still cadet, which is the lowest rung that you join on. And so I'd had enough. I was like, I'm putting all this effort in. I'm doing, as far as I was concerned, I was doing all the right things. So I was like, right, I quit. So I went to speak to the commanding officer and explained this was going to be my last evening there. And he obviously asked why, and I explained I hadn't been promoted, and I was pretty kind of, again, the my value of fairness was being very much tested. So I was probably putting myself forward a bit too forcefully to my commanding officer, who was an actual officer, a commissioned officer in the Royal Air Force. And he just kind of laughed. And I that made me really angry. But he was like, no, Simon, I'm really sorry. He goes, but this is a perfect example of why you're still a cadet. Like, we really like you. You're great. You're quite right. You've done all these things and you've represented us brilliantly. Problem is, you don't like following orders. And that's kind of a prerequisite in the military. It made a lot of sense. And obviously, many, many, many years later, I did the Capfinity Strengths Profile and found that adherence was one of my weaknesses, and everything made so much sense at that point. So I find it really interesting to actually really kind of have a look back at, what strengths have got me here, because it's genuinely telling. And I can't help but smile at looking at some of the things that have, particularly weirdly, some of the weaknesses that I've thankfully shied away from, rather than trying to fit myself into something that just didn't work. I've just thought, you know what, let's focus a bit more on my strengths without even realizing I was doing it. I've just been lucky really in the process. But also, again, really think about situations going forwards. How can I best approach this? Look at your strengths, reflect on them. What realized strengths, what unrealized strengths can you bring to bear? And it might be that being a bit creative with those strengths, because you might think, well, that doesn't completely fit, but you know what? That might impact it a bit. So bring that forward, and you'd be perhaps surprised at how you can really transform those tasks. And again, think about perception. We all have a personal brand, whether we realize it or not. And I think Jeff Bezos said, your personal brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. So it's well worth thinking about that and thinking, what do I want people to think about me? What perception do I want to give? And then finally, how can I communicate with this person? So think, ask, what strength can we bring to bear to communicate in the right way, at the right time with the right person? So the final element is all the tools that we've looked at. So again, I'm not going to go through these in detail because we've looked at every single one of them throughout this session. But please do kind of, again, have a pause, remind yourself, and perhaps find which for you, having very kindly watched this webinar the whole way through, what's resonated with you most? Which bit for you, which tool for you is going to be, and of course there might be more than one, but if you had to just pick one, what's been your top takeaway? And then how are you going to remember to do that? Because let's face it, we've all done these things before and then we got really busy and we've forgotten. So really make a commitment now. What are you going to do differently? What are you going to do more of or less of? What are you going to do and how are you going to remember to do it? And I can absolutely guarantee you that the more you practice and the more you try out different things, the more you'll find that leveraging your strengths becomes just a natural thing that you're not even having to think about anymore. And then you get a whole lot of benefits that come from that. So that is it from me. Oh no, that wasn't the slide. That was the slide I was going for. That's it from me. Thank you very much for watching. I really do hope you found it useful, and the best of luck going forward with your strengths.